Good morning, students, and welcome to your English class. Today, we will read an interesting lesson from your English literature book. It is lesson number 10. The name of the lesson is My Dearest Lizzy. So, without wasting any time further, let's start with today's class.
Jane Austen was a great woman novelist of the early 19th century. She was born on 16th December 1775. She always enjoyed reading and was passionate about literature. In the year 1796 to 1797, she wrote a novel called The First Impressions, which was later published as Pride and Prejudice. She died of ill health at a young age on 18th July 1870. Austen is known for irony in her novels. Situations often become comical and humorous because of irony. An important feature of her writing is social commentary. She herself was a part of the world she wrote about. She realistically portrayed the people and their customs as they existed in the English societies of her times. Some of the famous Jane Austen novels are Sense and Sensibility, published in the year 1811, Pride and Prejudice, published in the year 1813, Mansfield Park, published in 1814, Emma in 1815, Northanger Abbey in 1818, and Persuasion in 1818. The story My Dearest Lizzy is an extract from Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice, which was published in the year 1813 and was originally called The First Impressions. The story deals with five young and unmarried Bennet sisters. The protagonist of the novel The protagonists of the novel are Elizabeth Bennet and William Darcy, who initially dislike each other but eventually fall in love with each other. The story begins at Longbourn, where Mr. and Mrs. Bennet live with their five unmarried daughters: Jane Bennet, Elizabeth Bennet, Mary Bennet, Catherine Bennet, Lydia Bennet. Let's now talk about the major characters in this story. Elizabeth Bennet. She is the protagonist in this story, and she is initially put off by Mr. Darcy's cold manners, but further acquaintance with him changes her heart and she eventually marries him. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Darcy is a very wealthy friend of Charles Bingley. A minor character, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, is his aunt. Darcy is very high minded and looks down on those who are socially inferior. Jane Bennet. Jane Bennet is Elizabeth Bennet's sister. She is more conservative and warm than Elizabeth. She and Charles Bingley form a significant attachment when they first meet. After a tumultuous courtship, they eventually marry. Charles Bingley. Charles Bingley is the wealthy neighbor of the Bennets. He is also a friend of Mr. Darcy. He falls in love with Jane Bennet, much to Darcy's chagrin. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, the parents of the Bennet sisters. Mrs. Bennet is portrayed as a silly woman, and her husband enjoys antagonizing her. Let's now start with the story. This is an extract from Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice, which is about the spirited Bennet family. Mrs. Bennet is obsessed with finding suitable husbands for all her five daughters. When a wealthy young man, Charles Bingley, takes a house nearby, Mrs. Bennet is overjoyed. Her eldest daughter, Jane, succeeds in impressing Mr. Bingley. She is invited to his place at Netherfield. There she falls ill and sends a letter to her family. So, via introduction, we all are given an insight into Mrs. Bennet's way of thinking. She wants all her five daughters to marry wealthy men and settle down. She is very happy when she comes to know that Jane, her eldest daughter, has caught the attention of a wealthy young man, Charles Bingley, and Jane is even invited by him to Netherfield, where she falls ill and writes a letter to her family. Let's now read the content. Jane had not been gone long before it rained hard. Her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane certainly could not come back. "This was a lucky idea of mine, indeed," said Mrs. Bennet more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Till the next morning, however, she was not aware of the felicity of her contrivance. Breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note for Elizabeth. Now Jane is invited by Mr. Bingley, and on her way to Netherfield it starts raining, and it continues to rain the whole evening without any pause or without any interval. This makes her father and her four sisters quite uneasy and discomforting. But on the other hand, her mother is really delighted, thinking that Jane would not be able to come back for some time and will get some extra time with Charles Bingley. Here her mother gives all the credit to herself as if it was in her hands to make it rain at that point of time, and until the next morning Mrs. Bennet wasn't aware of the positive result of the arrangements she has done, that is, of sending Jane and the arrival of the ring. It was known to everyone only when the breakfast wasn't even properly over and a servant from Netherfield brought a note for Elizabeth. Let's now read what was there in that letter. "I find myself very unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning till I am better. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me. And, excepting a sore throat and headache, there is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc." Now, students, Elizabeth has received a letter from her sister who says that she isn't well and therefore the hosts at Netherfield, that is Charles Bingley, his sisters, and Mr. Darcy, will not let her leave before she is completely fine. Jane also writes about seeing Mr. Jones and asks her family not to worry about her as she is completely fine but has a sore throat and a headache. "Well, my dear," said Mr. Bennet, when Elizabeth had read the note aloud, "if your daughter should have a dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders." "Oh, I am not afraid of her dying. People do not die of little trifling colds. She will be taken good care of. As long as she stays there, it is all very well. I would go and see her if I could have the carriage." Now, after Elizabeth has read the letter aloud, sitting on the breakfast table, Mr. Bennet got quite upset and told Mrs. Bennet that if Jane died, then it will be a comfort for her to know that she died obeying her orders, trying to win Mr. Bingley's heart. To this, Mrs. Bennet immediately replied that she wasn't scared of her dying, and also said that no one can die of just a trifling cold. She also says that everything will be fine and Mr. Bennet need not worry as long as she stays in Netherfield with Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth, feeling really anxious, was determined to go to her, though the carriage was not to be had, and as she was no horsewoman, walking was her only alternative. She declared her resolution. How can you be so silly, cried her mother, as to think of such a thing in all this dirt? You will not be fit to be seen when you go there. I shall be very fit to see Jane, which is all I want. Is this a hint to me, Lizzy? Said her father, to send for the horses. No, indeed, I do not wish to avoid the walk. The distance is nothing when one has a motive. Only 3 miles. I shall be back by dinner. I admire the activity of your benevolence, observed Mary. But every impulse of feeling should be guided by reason, and, in my opinion, exertion should always be in proportion to what is required. We will go as far as Meryton with you, said Catherine and Lydia. Elizabeth accepted their company, and the three young ladies set off together. Now, after reading the letter written by her sister, Elizabeth got really anxious and she finally decided to see her sister. She could not take carriage, and since she wasn't a horsewoman, her only option was to walk to Netherfield. When she declared her decision, her mother yelled at her, asking her how could she be so silly to think of something like this, as walking the whole way to Netherfield would make her dirty and she shall not be fit to see Jane. But Elizabeth was very adamant on going, and said that she'd be very fit to see Jane, as that was the only thing she wanted at that time. Her father then asked her if she needed the horses, to which Elizabeth denied and said that distance is nothing when one has a motive. And after all, the distance is only 3 miles, and Elizabeth said that she shall be back by dinner. Now, while Elizabeth, her father, and her mother were having this conversation, Mary observingly said that she admired Elizabeth's act of kindness, but every impulse of feeling should be guided by a reason, and the amount of trouble taken while doing something should be equal to the desired result. Now, after Mary said this, Catherine and Lydia assured Elizabeth to accompany her as far as Meryton, to which Elizabeth agreed, and then the three young ladies set off together.